Hi friends, thank you so much for tuning into our channel. My name is Alicia and today I'm going to be sharing exactly how I built this coffered ceiling. I know how intimidating it is to tackle a big project like this, so whenever I share tutorials, I give as much detail as possible so that you feel confident tackling the project. I also have a blog post on this project, so I will link that below in the description. If you find this video helpful, it would mean so much if you could give it a thumbs up. And by the way, my husband and I just bought the cutest 1930 home. We named her Doris, and there are so many projects we have planned for her. We're going to be sharing our whole journey on YouTube, so we would love to formally invite you to subscribe and follow along because it's going to be fun. A little mock-up of the coffered ceiling that I'm building. So this, for example, is the ceiling here. These 2x6s get screwed up into the joists. You're going to use some scrap 2x6s to make little wedges. That'll add to the depth of the beams, but also gives you a place to nail in these 1x6 boards from the bottom. The sides will get covered up by these baseboards, but there's going to be a gap here you can see. That won't matter because it's going to be covered up by crown molding, which will be the last layer. And I left a little bit of a reveal on the bottom here, and that is it. I'd say the hardest part of this coffered ceiling build was just all of the planning that went into it. Once I figured out the beam design, it was a matter of measuring our room and figuring out exactly how much material I needed and also just the layout for the beams. I always recommend making a rough sketch of the outline of your room and marking your measurements down, and also making note of where any obstructions are, like vents, lights, fans, stuff like that. I knew I wanted a simple grid pattern with rows of 3, so I took the measurement of my bed wall. I subtracted 24 from that measurement because there would be 4 beams and each beam was about 6 inches. And then I took that number and divided it by 3, and that gave me the spacing in between each beam. I then repeated this with the perpendicular wall to give me the spacing I needed in the other direction, if that makes sense. You can see my little sketch here that I made. And if your room isn't a perfect square, don't let that deter you from doing a coffered ceiling. I was very worried about the corner area and how that was gonna look, but as you can see, it turned out beautifully. The next step is to mark the beam placement, and originally I was thinking I could use my laser level for this part, but laser levels, or at least the one I have, don't really work the best on a ceiling. So I ended up getting a chalk line, and it was my first time using one, but it worked awesome and it was so simple to use. Now you can't just bring the chalk line up to the ceiling and snap away. You have to have your lines marked exactly where the beams are going to be. So to do that, I actually just took a scrap piece of 2x6 and held it up to the ceiling and kind of traced a little line and repeated that on each end of the ceiling. My husband was there to help, so he would stand on one end of the wall and I would stand on the other. We would line it up with my little marks and then snap the line. And if you don't have somebody to help, there's actually a little metal part on the chalk line that you can attach to a screw in the ceiling. We're going to refer to this first layer of wood as our main beams, and I'm using 2x6s for this part. So our joists are running this way, so what I'm going to do is first install these boards this way so I can screw them up into the studs, and then these are all going to be smaller pieces, and I'll show you how I end up attaching those. But before I can attach those, I want to first mark exactly where our ceiling joists are. This way, you can pre-drill all of your screws exactly where the joists are. Ceiling work is not easy, and this little trick just makes a world's difference. If you're working alone, You will need some sort of help for this part because these boards are heavy and they're 8 feet long and you're holding it up overhead. But they actually make special tools specifically for things like this that help prop up the board. So I will link one of those in the description. We screwed the 2x6 boards into the ceiling joist using 3-inch construction screw. To attach 2 boards that are going in the same direction like this, we toe-nailed the screws in, meaning we drove it in at an angle. Once your main beams are screwed into the joist, then you're gonna do the cross beams. So these are gonna be shorter pieces, and for us, none of them were hitting ceiling joists. So to attach these to the main beams, we also screwed these in at an angle. To add depth to the beam, I used scrap pieces of 2x6 boards. Precision isn't a huge factor with this part. I cut them about 3 inches and spaced them about 16 inches apart, pre-drilling the screws just like I did in the previous step. All of this will get covered up anyway, which is why it's not really important that they're all the same exact size or the same exact distance apart. But the one thing you do want to be careful of is making sure that the 2x6 wedge is aligned nice and flush with the beam that's on the ceiling, because if one side is jutting out more than the other, the baseboard side pieces won't be able to sit flat. They're going to kind of tilt. So when that happens, if that happens, you can just shave off the excess with a multi-tool. Like we had to in a couple areas. Another important thing that I learned or didn't think about until after the fact is that you should have your wedges wherever you're gonna have seams with your bottom boards, which is the next layer of wood. You just wanna have that extra support. I didn't do that, so I had to, after the fact, kind of slide in some wedges and then nail them into those. The bottom part of the beam is a 1x6 board. You can buy these pre-primed, ready to go, but I decided to make my own to save money because it was $17 for one primed 1x6. The true measurement of a 1x6 is actually 3/4 of an inch by 5.5 inches. So what I did was I bought 2 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood and then ripped them down to 5.5 inches. After that, I just primed them, and by doing this, I saved about $100. To attach the bottom pieces, I used my brad nailer with 1.5 inch nails and nailed into those 2x6 wedges. I did 2 nails per wedge, but instead of nailing straight up into the wedge, you actually want to nail each one at the opposite angle. This way they really latch onto the wood. Certain areas needed shims in order to make sure the bottom boards were nice and flush with each other. So make sure you grab a couple packs of those. I think I went through maybe a pack and a half. If you've never used shims, they're these little tapered pieces of scrap wood, so they start really thin and kind of get thicker, and you'll just slide the smaller part in until your board adjusts nice and flush, and then you're gonna have this piece sticking out that you'll just cut off with your multi-tool. After all of the bottom pieces were up, this was when I filled all of the nail holes and seams using a wood filler. And it just made the most sense for me to sand this all down before putting up the side pieces, because the side pieces of the beam extend lower than the bottom piece, so it would have been a bit of a pain to sand after. For the side pieces, I decided to use baseboards that have a little bit of detailing on them just to add some more visual interest. I mentioned before that the baseboards or the side pieces come down lower than the bottom piece, so that's gonna just give this nice reveal and again just a little bit more visual interest. And so I used a scrap piece of 1/4 inch plywood and used that as my jig. Moving my jig along as I was working, I nailed the baseboards into the wedges using my brad nailer and 1¼ inch nails. You won't be able to see where the wedges are anymore because you're covering up the sides now, but you can tell by looking at the bottom board and where you nailed those into the wedges, and so just reference that. Also notice that there's a big gap above the baseboards once they're attached. Don't worry about that because the crown molding, which is the next layer of wood, will cover that gap up. Having this gap was actually intentional. You want to have a little bit of leeway. If I were to get baseboards or side pieces that were the exact height of the ceiling down to like my 1/4 inch reveal, then if the ceiling was uneven, the reveal would be off. And so we don't want that. We want to have a little extra room to work with. Even with all of the careful measuring, my baseboard corners definitely didn't all line up perfectly. And it's okay because actually the crown molding went down far enough that it covered most of the gap. But for the rest of it, that's what caulk is for. So actually, rather than waiting until I put up the crown molding to do all the caulking, I did some of it before just because it was easier to get those baseboard corners. And then while I was up there, I also did the reveal. If you're new to installing crown molding, I have a very detailed blog post sharing all my tips and tricks for that, so I will link that below. Just like with the baseboard trim pieces, you'll want to measure for each piece individually. I also recommend cutting a little bit bigger than what your measurement says, because if you cut it too short, you're risking that piece of crown. It might be unusable, and crown is expensive. So I would usually cut it like a 1/16 of an inch bigger. And if it didn't work, I would just cut down slivers until it fit nicely. I find it incredibly helpful to work with 2 pieces at a time, especially in a corner, which with a coffered ceiling, it's all corners. It's like I installed crown molding on 9 miniature ceilings. The thing with crown molding that's tricky is that it's hard to tell if it's positioned properly. You want to make sure it's at the exact right angle. One way to do this is to have 2 corners meet up. What I would do is I'd grab my 2 pieces, bring them up to the ceiling, and just kind of tilt and adjust them until the corner seam was nice and flush. Once it was, I would let go of one piece and then nail in the other piece in the middle of the board. So by nailing in the middle of the board, that just gives me more room to manipulate the sides of the boards if needed. To install the crown molding, I used 1½ inch brad nails, and I nailed along the bottom of the crown molding, trying to nail into those wedges, and then also nailed up into the ceiling on the top of the crown. The last layer of trim is not really necessary, but it is an alternative to caulking all of the gaps around the room. I also felt like this just gave the ceiling more of a finished look, and it really didn't add much extra cost either. Whatever trim you choose, you just want to make sure that it's big enough to cover your biggest gap. The trim that I used was very little and delicate, so I believe I just used 1-inch brad nails to install this. And after those were all up, I did the rest of the finish work, filling in those nail holes, caulking all of the crown molding, which took a while. And then after that, I painted the entire bedroom burgundy, which was controversial, but we absolutely loved it. We are in a new home now, but of all of the spaces in our previous house, our bedroom is what I miss the most. That bedroom just felt like a big hug when you walk into it, and the coffered ceiling and all of the trim work in there is a huge part of that. It just made the space feel very luxury and also cozy and traditional. It visually heightened the room. It's just such an awesome ceiling treatment, and I hope that this tutorial was helpful to you.